The gravel bit into her knees when she hit the ground, but Claire Beaumont didn't feel it. She didn't feel the November cold cutting through her paramedic jacket either, or the freezing rain soaking through to her skin. What she felt, the only thing she felt, was the dog pressed against her ribs, warm and trembling, and the specific, nauseating certainty that she had just made a decision she could not take back. 3 seconds earlier, she had seen the blade. 1 second earlier, she had moved. Now there was a fire spreading across her left side that had nothing to do with warmth. Riverview Regional Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Lethbridge, Alberta, the kind of mid-sized prairie city that people from elsewhere called quiet and people from there called home. It served 3 counties, 2 First Nations communities, and the steady, unrelenting flow of highway accidents that came with being planted beside the Trans-Canada corridor. Claire had worked its emergency bay for 6 years, first as a flight paramedic rotating in from the base at Fort Macleod, then as a senior trauma responder embedded with the hospital's critical care team. She was 34 years old, unmarried by choice, and known among her colleagues for 2 things: an almost eerie ability to stay calm in catastrophic situations, and a stubborn refusal to eat anything from the vending machine on the 3rd floor. She had done 2 rotations with Joint Task Force 2 in a medical support capacity before her contract ended. She had seen things in those rotations that she had filed away somewhere deep and lightless. Things she did not discuss at dinner parties or on first dates. What those years had given her, beyond the filed-away things, was a specific kind of spatial awareness, the ability to read a room before she was fully inside it, to sense weight shifting in a crowd, to know, before she could articulate why, that something was wrong. That instinct had been pinging softly for 20 minutes before it mattered. It had been a Thursday, the first genuinely cold one of the season, with sleet coming down in thin gray curtains and the parking lot outside the ambulance bay turned to a slick, treacherous mirror. The shift had started at 1800 hours and moved with the particular exhausted rhythm of a midweek evening. 2 chest pains, 1 diabetic episode, a laceration from a table saw that took longer to document than to close, burnt. Claire had been halfway through her break when the sliding doors opened and the paramedics came through fast, pushing a gurney with purpose. The man on it was enormous, even collapsed, even unconscious, even with his face gray and sheened with sweat. There was something about his physical architecture that spoke of constructed, deliberate power. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 41 years old, a former corporal with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, 3 tours including Kandahar, currently receiving outpatient support through the Lethbridge Veterans Transition Center. He had driven himself to a gas station on Mayor Magrath Drive that afternoon before his legs stopped cooperating. The paramedics had found him slumped against his truck, burning with fever, his blood pressure dropping through the floor. Sepsis. The old wound on his right thigh, shrapnel from an IED that the surgeons in Kandahar had cleared as well as they could, had been seeding his bloodstream for days with something that had finally tipped into systemic catastrophe. He was crashing, and he was crashing fast. He had not come alone. Beside the gurney, padding in tight, anxious circles that the paramedics kept trying and failing to interrupt, was a dog. A golden Labrador, large for the breed, wearing a red service vest that read, "Do not pet, working." The dog's name, according to the tag on his collar, was Ranger. His fur was soaked from the rain and his tail was not wagging. His eyes moved constantly between Marcus's face and the faces of the people surrounding him, reading the energy in the room with the focused attention of an animal trained to do exactly that. Ranger was a PTSD service dog, matched to Marcus through a non-profit that specialized in pairing veterans with trained animals. He had been with Marcus for 2 years. According to the intake notes, one of the paramedics had pulled from Marcus's phone. Ranger was not to be separated from his handler during medical treatment unless absolutely necessary. The documentation was signed by Marcus's psychiatrist in Calgary and carried the force of a formal accommodation request. Dr. Yolanda Tran, the attending physician that night, looked at the dog and then at the gurney and made the face of a person doing rapid triage of a problem that was not in the textbook. "We can't have the animal in trauma too," she said, not unkindly. "Get someone from security to take him outside or hold him in the corridor." "He'll escalate," Claire said. She had crossed the bay without quite deciding to, her break forgotten. She had read the vest, read the documentation on the paramedic's phone over his shoulder, and read the dog, who was now emitting a low, barely audible sound that was not quite a whine and not quite a growl, but was clearly distress. Separation anxiety in working service animals can trigger reactive behavior. He'll bark, he might bite, he won't settle, and Marcus will hear it if he comes around, which will not help his blood pressure. Tran looked at her. "I did a rotation with the Operational Stress Injury Clinic in Edmonton," Claire said. "I know this breed of problem." "Can you manage him?" "Yes." "Then manage him. I need the bay clear." Claire clicked her tongue twice, a sound she had learned from the handler who'd trained Ranger's predecessor at the clinic, and the dog turned to look at her. She held out her hand, palm down, and let him smell her without pressure. He did, his nostrils working quickly, and something in his posture shifted by 3 degrees, not relaxed, but willing. She walked toward the side corridor that led to the staff entrance and the small covered outdoor area beyond it, and Ranger followed. The covered area was not much to look at, a square of concrete beneath a corrugated steel overhang, bounded on 3 sides by the building, and on the 4th by a chain-link fence that faced the back parking lot. There was a picnic table, several cigarette urns, and a motion sensor light that worked about 60% of the time. Tonight it was working. Claire sat on the edge of the table, and Ranger pressed himself against her legs, his warmth immediate and substantial through the thin fabric of her scrubs. "He's going to be all right," she told the dog, which she knew was absurd and did not care. "They're good in there. Tran is excellent. He's going to be all right." Ranger put his chin on her knee. She should have heard the gate. Later, she would go back over it many times. The specific texture of those minutes, looking for the moment she lost the thread of her instinct. She thought it was the dog, the specific gravitational pull of sitting in the cold with a frightened animal who needed steadying. She had been focused inward on the weight of his head, on the sound of his breathing, slowing into something calmer. She had not been reading the room. The gate was not locked. It was never locked. It was a staff exit, not a secure perimeter. The figure who came through it at 9:47 that evening did not sneak. He simply opened the gate and walked in, and by the time Claire registered the motion and looked up, he was already inside. His name was Denny Arcand, though she would not learn that until later. He was 29, thin in the way that people who are not eating get thin, with a face that had the hollowed-out, accelerated look of long-term methamphetamine use. He had been in the parking lot for almost an hour. The police would later establish that he had been there since shortly after the ambulance arrived, having followed the vehicle from the gas station on Mayor McGrath Drive, where Marcus Webb had confronted him earlier that afternoon. The confrontation had been brief and, from most perspectives, unremarkable. Arcand had been harassing a teenage girl, working the cash register, following her around the store, refusing to leave when asked. Marcus had been standing at the coffee station. He had set down his cup, walked over, positioned himself between Arcand and the girl, and said, in a voice that carried no heat whatsoever, that it was time to go. That was all. No threats, no escalation. Just the absolute, grounded certainty of a man who had spent years standing between things that needed protecting and things that threatened them. Arcand had left. But he had looked at the truck in the parking lot on his way out. He had followed the ambulance because the part of his brain that methamphetamine had been rewiring for the past 4 years had translated his humiliation into something that needed to be answered. He had not planned carefully. He had not planned at all. He had simply followed and waited and eventually seen the big dog being led into the back of the building by a woman in blue scrubs. A trained dog like that was worth money. That was the thought. It was not a sophisticated thought, but it had the tight, insistent quality of all thoughts in a mind narrowed by stimulants and sleeplessness, and it had kept him in the parking lot for 53 minutes. The knife was a folding hunter's blade, 4 inches, which he had been carrying in his jacket pocket for 6 weeks, for reasons that shifted depending on the day. Claire was on her feet before she had consciously processed what she was seeing. That was the training, not thought, but movement, the body acting on information before the narrative brain had assembled it into language. "Hey," she said, "you can't be back here. This is a staff area." Arcand did not answer. His eyes were on Ranger. Ranger had gone rigid. The service vest was still on, but the working dog was somewhere underneath it now, responding to something older than his training. His lips had pulled back. His body was coiled. "Hey!" Claire's voice dropped. She had used this register before, not in hospitals, in other places. Look at me right now." He did look at her. His eyes were not right. She had seen enough to know that in under a second. Moved toward the dog. The knife came up. What happened in the next 4 seconds was not a decision in any meaningful sense. Claire Beaumont had been trained by the Canadian Forces to render aid under fire. She had pulled a wounded man out of a ditch in a country that was not hers while people shot at her from a tree line 200 meters away. She had performed a surgical airway on a woman in the back of a helicopter in a snowstorm. She was not, in any simple sense, brave. She was trained, and her training had built in her a specific and durable reflex. When a body is in danger, and your body is between the threat and the body, you use your body. She stepped in front of Ranger. The blade caught her across the left forearm first. She had raised it, and then, as she turned to push the dog behind her, it found the space between her shoulder and her neck. 1. She went to one knee. The dog pressed against her back, still blocked. 2. The blade came down into her left shoulder deep, and she felt the specific grinding sensation of steel on bone. 3. She was on both knees. She had her arms wrapped around Ranger, her body curled over his. The next one caught her across the back, diagonal, and she heard herself make a sound she had not made since Kandahar. 4. She fell. She went down onto her side and used the last of her controlled movement to keep herself between Arcand and the dog, her back to the threat, her arms still around Ranger. 5. She did not feel the 5th one clearly. There was a generalized white noise of pain and the specific, detailed sensation of the cold concrete against her cheek and the dog's breath against her face. And then, from somewhere that felt very far away, a sound that she would later describe to the police as the best thing she had ever heard. 68 pounds of Labrador Retriever turned out, in the event, to be considerably more dangerous than his vest suggested. Ranger was a service animal. He was trained for de-escalation, for grounding, for calm. He was also a dog, and the person he was bonded to had just collapsed in front of him, and the animal responsible was still standing. He came around Claire's body with a sound she had never heard from him, and when he connected with Denny Arkin's forearm, the crack was audible. Arkand screamed. The knife hit the concrete. He pulled free. Ranger's training reasserted itself at the last moment, the bite releasing rather than savaging, and he scrambled backward, hit the fence, went over it with the panicked, graceless speed of pure adrenaline, and disappeared into the dark and the rain. Ranger came back to Claire. He put his nose against her cheek. He whined, low and continuous. He stepped around her in a circle and came back. He lay down pressed against her, his body heat against hers, and he did not move. It was one of the other paramedics, Sanjay Mehta, on his way out for his own break, who heard the dog and found them. He did not freeze. He keyed his radio before he was fully through the door. Code trauma, staff courtyard, multiple stab wounds, paramedic down. I need everyone out here now. They brought her in fast. Tran left Marcus's room to the resident and came herself. The paperwork would later record 5 penetrating wounds, the forearm laceration, a deep shoulder wound with a fractured scapula, the back laceration that had missed her spine by centimeters, and 2 abdominal injuries, the 4th wound catching her oblique and nicking the bowel, 5th, entering her flank and nicking a renal vessel. The surgery lasted 7 hours and 20 minutes. At 2:41 in the morning, her blood pressure crashed. The monitors went flat. For 16 seconds, the anesthesiologist count, the room held its breath. Dr. Tran brought her back. She came back fighting. The nurses would say that later, not as poetry but as clinical description. Her vitals stabilized into something fragile but real, and they moved her to the ICU and put her in a medically induced coma and waited. Marcus Webb opened his eyes at 6:15 the following morning. He had been moved to a private room sometime after midnight, when the antibiotics had finally caught up with the infection, and his fever had broken, and his blood pressure had climbed back into something survivable. He lay still for a moment, assembling the room, the ceiling, the window, the gray prairie dawn pressing against the glass, and then he sat up. The space beside his bed was empty. He had not known he was going to say the word out loud until he heard himself say it. Ranger. The nurse on duty was young, maybe 25, with the look of someone who had been awake for longer than they'd expected and was managing it. She stood up immediately. Mr. Webb, please, you need to stay lying down. Where is my dog? His voice was quiet. It was always quiet. That was the thing about Marcus Webb, the thing that his colleagues at the PPCLI had known, and that Arkand had misread as passivity at the gas station. The quieter his voice got, the more weight it carried. The door opened. A man in a civilian suit came in, followed by a woman in the blue uniform of the Lethbridge Police Service. The man introduced himself as the hospital's patient services director. He looked like someone who had practiced this conversation in the mirror. Mr. Webb, he said, your dog is safe. He's with our security team in a consultation room. He hasn't been hurt. Marcus looked at him without expression. Last night, the man continued, there was an incident. He told it carefully and with evident distress. The courtyard, the man who had come through the gate. The paramedic, a senior member of the trauma team, a woman named Claire Beaumont, who had been in the courtyard with Ranger when it happened. She stepped in front of the blade, the services director said. He paused. She took 5 wounds. She's in the ICU. It was very serious. She's stable now, but it was very serious. Marcus was quiet for a long time. The man, he said. We don't have him yet, the detective said. We have blood evidence from the courtyard, a description. We're checking emergency clinics, but... Take me to her, Marcus said. Mr. Webb, you were in septic shock 12 hours ago. You cannot. Take me to her. Hollinged. They brought a wheelchair. He sat in it like a man performing compliance rather than a man who needed it. They took him to the ICU first. Ranger was waiting in the corridor. The security officer who'd been keeping him company stepped back when he saw Marcus, and Ranger crossed the distance between them at a controlled trot that broke into something less controlled at the last second. Marcus put both hands on the dog's face and held it for a moment, forehead to forehead, and said something too quiet to hear her. Then he looked through the glass at the woman in the bed. She was younger than he'd expected. Dark hair, pale in the specific way of blood loss, a paleness that was not about complexion. She was connected to a ventilator, a central line, a urinary catheter, 2 peripheral IVs, a monitor whose numbers Marcus read automatically and did not like. She lay completely still, which was the point, the medical coma holding her under while her body worked the problem of staying alive. He did not know her. He had never seen her face before. He knew only what the services director had told him, that she had been sitting with his dog in the cold and the rain, at no obligation to anyone, and had put her body between his dog and a blade. He looked at her for a long time. Aunt. Ranger pressed against his knee and looked at her too. Find me my phone, Marcus said. The nurse who'd followed them hesitated. Mr. Webb, your priority right now needs to be your own. Please, he said, just the one word, but the nurse went. He called a number he had not called in 14 months. It rang 3 times. Webb. The voice on the other end was deep and completely awake despite it being barely past 7 in the morning. Sergeant Major Dale Kowalchuk, retired, currently running the Veterans Outreach Program out of the Legion Hall on 5th Avenue South. Dale, Marcus said, I'm at Riverview Regional. I know. Terry from the Transition Center texted last night. The hell happened to you? The old shrapnel it's handled. But there's something else. He told it the same way it had been told to him, plainly, without inflation. The courtyard, the paramedic, the 5 wounds. Kowalchuk was quiet for a moment. She going to make it? I don't know yet. Is the dog all right? He's here with me. Another pause. The guy? Police have nothing. He's got a shattered arm from Ranger. He can't go to a legitimate clinic. They'd flag him. But he needs medical attention, or he'll go septic the same way I did. Kowalchuk had a particular way of saying that syllable that meant he was running geometry. She's one of ours, Dale, Marcus said. I know she didn't sign up for ours, but she is. The line was quiet for a few seconds. Give me the day, Kowalchuk said. You rest. You let those doctors do their work. Give me the day. The line clicked off. Marcus lowered the phone. Ranger put his head on Marcus's knee and watched the glass door of Claire's room. The word moved the way it always moves in those communities. Not through official channels, not through the clean logistics of rank and order, but through the invisible infrastructure of people who have been through things together and therefore understand what is owed. Texts, phone calls, men and women who looked at their screens over morning coffee and immediately started putting on their jackets. Hurt. Kowalchuk worked the phones from the Legion Hall, with the focused economy of a man who had spent 30 years coordinating complex operations. By noon, he had contact with people he hadn't spoken to in years. By 2 in the afternoon, the shape of what was happening had become clear. Across Lethbridge, in coffee shops, in trucks parked outside hardware stores, in the quiet hours between appointments at the OSI clinic, veterans were putting out their own feelers. They knew the city's gray market the way anyone knows the infrastructure of a place they've lived in long enough. They knew which shelters had loose lips, which rooming houses ran on cash and asked no questions, which back alley operators worked on people who couldn't access legitimate care. A man named Garrett, they had a name now passed along from someone who'd spoken to someone at the gas station, with a destroyed right arm and methamphetamine in his system and a desperate need to not exist in any official record, had limited options. A retired medic from one field ambulance squadron, a woman named Anita Crow Eagle, who now ran a harm reduction outreach van in the North End, got the call at 4:15. A man matching the description had shown up at a known safe supply site on the edge of the Riverdale neighborhood, trying to trade opioids for wound care. She had not provided wound care. She had asked 2 questions, gotten 2 answers, and called Kowalchuk. Kowalchuk called 3 people. Those 3 called others. By 5 in the evening, Denny Arcand was sitting in the back seat of a pickup truck belonging to a retired PPCLI sergeant named Devereaux, his wrists zip-tied with a calm technical efficiency that suggested Devereaux had done this before in conditions considerably less forgiving. He was not beaten. He was not threatened in any way he could legally articulate. He was simply removed from the condemned house in Riverdale, where he had been self-administering a cocktail of stolen first aid supplies, and he was driven, directly and without conversation, to the Lethbridge Police Service detachment on 5th Avenue. The door of the truck opened. Arcand was helped out with the same clinical detachment. Beside him on the steps, Devereaux placed a manila envelope. It contained a printed photograph from the gas station's exterior camera, showing Arcand's face clearly. It contained a statement from the teenage cashier who had been there. It contained a plastic evidence bag holding a piece of the serrated blade that had broken off against Claire's scapula and been found in the courtyard by someone who'd thought to look before the rain washed everything away. By the time the desk sergeant came through the doors, the truck was gone. Inside the Riverview Regional ICU, the night shift was quiet. Marcus had refused to go back to his room. He had been refused the right to refuse twice and had simply reappeared in the corridor outside the ICU, each time Ranger at his heel, sitting in the vinyl chair with the particular stillness of a man who is accustomed to waiting. Eventually, the staff had stopped arguing. Someone had brought him a blanket. Someone else had brought coffee. Brenda, the charge nurse, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head like a permanent accessory, had sat with him for a while around midnight. "You know what she's like?" Brenda said, not asking exactly. "I know what she did. She fostered animals from the shelter on 43rd. She drove to Calgary once in a blizzard to pick up a dog that was going to be euthanized if no one claimed it that day." Brenda took a sip of her tea. "She worked a double last Christmas because someone on the day shift had family coming in from Prince Edward Island. She didn't explain herself. She just did things." "People like that don't explain themselves," Marcus said. "No, they don't." Brenda was quiet. "She's going to be furious about the vacation time she's losing." Marcus almost smiled, almost. Ranger's tail moved once, slowly, and then he put his head back down on his paws. At 8:47 the following morning, Marcus was looking out the window at the end of the ICU corridor when the first truck rolled into the visitor parking lot. He watched it park with the automatic, unconscious attention of a man who reads vehicles the way other people read faces. Then another truck, then an SUV, then 3 more, then a wave. They came steadily, without drama. Men and women in civilian clothes, jeans, work jackets, base-issue parkas that they'd kept for years and worn softer than any retail item. They parked in orderly rows that were not quite military, but carried the muscle memory of discipline. They got out of their vehicles and they walked toward the building and they stopped. They fanned out around the courtyard, around the covered staff entrance, around the perimeter of the building. They did not impede the ambulance bay. They did not block the automatic doors. They stood, hands clasped or in their pockets, faces forward, in a silence that was not empty but full. Marcus counted. He counted until he stopped at 147 and realized he had missed some. Behind him he heard a small sound from Claire's room. The monitor, the one that had been beeping in the specific rhythm of supported, medicated sleep since he'd arrived. It had changed. Not alarm, not crisis, but different. A shift in the pattern. He turned, where Dr. Tran was already moving. Brenda was right behind her. Through the glass, Marcus watched the two of them enter the room, watched their body language, watched for the specific gestures of emergency. They did not move fast. They moved carefully, attentively, with the posture of people reading something unexpected and so far good. Ranger pressed himself against Marcus's knee and looked. Claire Beaumont opened her eyes at 9:12 in the morning on a Friday. The light above her was institutional and painful. Her throat was occupied by something large and uncomfortable. She was aware of weight. The weight of her own body, specifically the weight of her left shoulder, and the weight of her midsection, in the way you are aware of a power line running through a wall, not touching it but knowing it is there and live. She blinked. Face swam into focus. Tran, she knew Tran's face. Then Brenda, behind her, with her glasses still pushed up on her head, crying quietly in the way that Brenda cried, with no particular effort to stop. The ventilator tube was uncomfortable in a way that was going to keep being uncomfortable until it wasn't there anymore, and Claire was aware enough of basic physiology to know that she shouldn't try to manage that herself. She moved her fingers instead. She found the mattress. She found a hand, Brenda's, and pressed it once. Brenda said something she couldn't fully hear over the ventilator's rhythm and her own pulse in her ears. Tran was checking the monitors. Her expression had the quality of someone managing professional composure with real effort. She said something that Claire processed as "you're doing well," or possibly "you had us going." The words weren't fully landing yet, just the tone, which was relief. Then something pressed against Claire's right hand from below, and she looked down. A large golden head, wet nose against her knuckles, eyes the color of dark honey, watching her face with an attention that felt, in her reduced and tender state, almost unbearable in its steadiness. Ranger's tail moved once, then again. "Hey," Claire tried to say, which came out as nothing at all through the ventilator, but her hand moved, fingers finding the warm fur behind his ear, and that was enough. He did not move. He did not perform joy or relief in the way that some dogs do, all body and noise. He simply stayed, his chin resting on the edge of her mattress, his eyes on hers, present in the specific and complete way of an animal that has been waiting through the night and has no interest in being anywhere else. There was a man in a wheelchair to her right. She had to turn her head to see him clearly. He was large, with the built-in structure of someone who had spent years carrying weight, and a face that was composed in a way that did not quite conceal what was happening behind it. He was wearing a hospital gown, which under other circumstances might have seemed incongruous. He had dark eyes, and they were wet. He reached out and put his hand over hers, the hand that was resting on the dog's head, and he did not say anything for a moment. "My name is Marcus," he said. "This is Ranger." She knew that. She had known the dog's name. She couldn't say it yet, but she knew it. "I need you to understand something," Marcus said, and his voice was careful and steady in the way of someone who has decided to say a thing and is going to say it completely. "You didn't have to do what you did. I know that. You know that. You could have run. Anyone would have run." He stopped. "But you didn't. And I have been trying to figure out, since yesterday morning, whether there is anything in the world I can do with that." Claire blinked at him. "There are people outside," he said. "A lot of people. Veterans from the base and the transition center and a lot of other places. They came because of you. They're going to keep coming back." He looked at her steadily. "You pulled someone out of danger in a war zone, except the war zone was a parking lot in Lethbridge, and it was a dog, and you didn't have orders and you didn't have backup." His jaw moved. "That is the job. That is exactly what the job is, and we don't forget it. We don't forget the people who do it." Brenda was still crying. Tran was looking at her monitors with the intense focus of someone who is choosing not to cry in a professional setting. Ranger made a sound very low in his chest, not a whine, not quite a sound at all, just a vibration of presence. "Look out the window," Marcus said softly. "When you're able, when you're ready." She did not look right away. She was not ready right away. It took another hour, and it took Tran removing the ventilator tube in a process that was as unpleasant as advertised, and it took Brenda producing ice chips and a look of ferocious maternal satisfaction, and it took Claire lying quietly for a while, just breathing air without assistance, which, after 7 hours of a machine doing it for her, felt extraordinary. But eventually, she turned her head toward the window. The morning light was coming through gray and clean. Below, in the visitor parking lot, and along the perimeter of the courtyard, where she had lain on cold concrete, with a dog pressed against her, and her blood going somewhere she couldn't afford to send it. She could see them, dozens, standing in the thin November sun with their hands clasped, still, not marching, not performing, just there. Some of them had been there since the night before. Some of them had driven from Calgary, from Medicine Hat, from as far as Red Deer. A woman who looked about Claire's own age glanced up and saw the window, saw her, and placed one hand flat against her chest. Claire felt something give way somewhere deep and structural. Something she hadn't known was braced. She had spent a decade moving toward danger when other people moved away from it. She had done it in other countries, and on highway medians, and in the back of helicopters, and on one ordinary Thursday evening in November, in a staff courtyard that smelled like cigarette ash and rain. She had never done it for recognition or because anyone was watching. But she was tired, and she was hurt, and she was alive. And below her window stood 160 people who had driven from all over southern Alberta on a workday to tell her, without a single word, that she had not been alone when it mattered, and that she would not be alone going forward. Ranger put his chin back on the edge of her bed. She put her hand on his head. Outside, the morning light held, cold and clear and very bright, over the city and the people standing in it, and Claire Beaumont, who had never once in her life waited to be told what the right thing to do was, closed her eyes and let herself, at last, be kept. "I keep thinking about the gate. It wasn't locked. It was never locked. And that's the part that stays with me. Not the knife, not the blood, not the monitors flatlining at 2:41 in the morning. It's the unlocked gate. Because the gate is where everything hinged, where one person's choice to walk through it changed every single thing that followed. Burnt. Claire didn't know Denny Arcand. She didn't know Marcus. She had met Ranger for maybe 40 minutes before the gate opened. She had no obligation to anyone in that courtyard except herself. And that's what I find myself sitting with, long after the story ends. The fact that she acted anyway. Not because of rules, not because someone was watching, not because there was a reward attached to it. She acted because of who she already was before any of this happened. That's not something you manufacture in a moment. That's something you build, slowly, over years of small decisions that nobody records. There's a word for that kind of character, and it's not heroism, because heroism sounds like an event. What Claire had was something quieter and more durable. It was integrity, the kind that doesn't negotiate with circumstances. She had spent years training her judgment and her nerve in places where the cost of a bad decision was immediate and irreversible. That training didn't make the choice for her. It just meant that when the moment came, she already knew what she valued, and she moved toward it without waiting for permission. And then there's Marcus, a man with a shattered immune system in a hospital bed, who hears about a stranger taking 5 wounds for his dog and immediately asks for his phone. He could have grieved privately. He could have sent flowers. Instead, he made one call, said 4 words, "She's one of ours," and trusted that the people on the other side of that call would understand what was being asked without it being spelled out. That's not just loyalty. That's the intelligence of knowing which networks carry real weight and the wisdom to activate them at the right moment, for the right reason. What strikes me is the chain of it. Marcus's integrity, years before the hospital, at a gas station, where he had no obligation to intervene, set something in motion. His willingness to stand between a frightened teenager and a threat cost him nothing in the moment and cost him enormously later. But it also brought him into the orbit of a woman who would shield his dog with her own spine. And his response to that, the call to Kowalchuk, the one word understood on the other end of the line, brought 160 people to a parking lot in Lethbridge on a cold November morning. None of it was accidental. Every link in that chain was a choice someone made to act with more decency than the situation required. I think about what it takes to become that kind of person, not what it takes to perform it once, in a crisis, in front of witnesses, but to be so thoroughly shaped by it that it's just the thing you do. It takes years of choosing correctly when no one is looking. It takes the discipline to keep your judgment sharp even when you're exhausted. It takes the particular kind of resilience that doesn't harden you but keeps you open, keeps you willing to be moved, to be affected, to care about a dog that isn't yours on a rainy Thursday night. Claire closed her eyes at the end with her hand on Ranger's head and 160 strangers standing in the cold outside her window. She didn't earn that by being exceptional. She earned it by being consistent. That's the only thing I know how to take from a story like this. Not inspiration, exactly. More like a question I have to keep answering every day with my own small choices, in my own unlocked gates, when nobody's watching and there's no ambulance coming.